Hello everyone, so I'm here today to do my stats wrap up for 2022. So this is for all the stats for my reading that Storygraph gives me. And I'm going to be looking down because I have the stats in my phone. So first of all, I finished 152 books, and that means 47,169 pages, which I think is fine. I think that anything between 100 and 150-ish books is good. I never put a goal for me to read a number of books or a number of pages because I never know what's going to happen that year anyway, and I think that detracts you to read smaller or bigger books or whatever, or like slower books. So I never bother on putting a limit in that sense to my reading, so this doesn't mean too much to me, but cool. Then the first book I read in the year is Wind, Sun and Stars by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and this was fun, so it was a good way to start the year. And then the last book I read was Les Oniriques by Ruggero, and this was for my Read Around the World project, and I have talked about it in my wrap up, but this was okay. And the writing was very beautiful, but the story itself was nothing that I was super in love with. Then there is another graph about moods, and it seems that at the beginning of the year I read some lighter, more happy books, and then my mood reading went down. I think that this was just because at the beginning of the year I had a 2-month-old baby and I just wanted something light and fluffy, and as the year progressed I just went into my normal mood of reading, which is normally dark and heavy. And then it also says you reflected on ideas, felt all the feels and stretched your mind, and most of the stories developed at a steady pace. That sounds about right for me. I think that I like books that challenge my ideas and stretch my mind, as it says here. And yeah, I don't like super fast books and I don't like super slow books, I think, so this sounds about right. Then there is a graph with the number of books and pages each month, and it seems that there was sort of a steady around 10 books a month kind of pace, except from June, July, and August, I think, and that is probably because of Booker, and probably also because I do this thing in which I don't have script all year round, but there are certain months when I have enough books that I want to read from script that I will get a month or two, and then I will listen to all of the books that I want to listen from script, so I don't pay the whole year, but I pay a couple of months here and there. And I think this really high points also coincide with the moments in which I had audios in script. So yeah, that's a bit of an insight into my reading ways. The genres I spent the most time with was literary, which sounds about right. It's basically most of what I read. Historical, contemporary, history, and LGBTQIA. Yeah, I like historical fiction as well, so yeah, this sounds about right again. The longest book I read was The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk with 965 pages, which again, yeah, sounds about right. It was long and it was difficult, but it was also very interesting. And the shortest book I read was Small Things Like This by Claire Keegan with 73 pages. There has been all this debate about what was shorter, if Small Things Like This or Trickle Walker in the Booker shortlist. Apparently Storygraph thinks that Small Things Like This is the shortest one. Yeah, it was very short. It was too short in my opinion for what it was trying to do. The average length of the books I read was 308 pages, and it took me around 5 days to finish each book, which, yeah, I mean, 300 pages for a book, it's like the average, I think, but I think that the 5 days to finish books, it's because I was reading several books at the same time. Because if you do the calculation, if it takes me 5 days to read a 300-page book, if you calculate how many books I can read one at a time in the year, it's a lot less than what I read. So yeah, I think that's why that is there. But I found that I do like reading one book at a time, but also sometimes I need something, especially when the book is very long, I need something to break it up. So I'm trying to find a balance between those two things, between breaking really big books up and reading one book at a time. At the moment, I think I don't want to be reading more than 2 or 3 books at the same time, and I think it also depends first on what the book is about, what kind of book it is, like for fiction, non-fiction, very literary, very non-literary, but also the format. So I like to have an ebook in the go because it's easier to pull up, and also because not anymore so much, but I used to have to wake up in the middle of the night and feed Alex and stuff like that, and then an ebook is very useful because you don't have to turn on the light. So ebooks have been a great help at the moment, but I want to also move more into physical books because I think I get more from them. So yeah, that was a very long explanation for this small thing. The book that I read the fastest is How to Order the Universe by Maria Jose Ferrada, which I read for the Booktube Prize, and it took me 1 day to read. This was a very short book as well. It was like 150 pages, and it was very like vignette-like and very episodic, so it went really fast. So I'm not surprised, and I think it's one of those that you are supposed to read in a day. The one that took me the most time is The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, which took me 34 days. And again, I was reading other things in the middle because this was one of those very heavy books that I was not very understanding, and I could appreciate what it was trying to do and the writing and all that, but I'm not sure I could say I was enjoying it. So it took me a long time to read, and maybe that also was part of why I didn't enjoy it as much. I don't know. The authors that I spent the most time with was J.K. Rowling, because I reread Harry Potter at the beginning of the year because I needed something light and comforting, and John Fosse because I read the trilogy for the International Booker. So yeah, not surprised there, but I'm surprised that I didn't read any other author more than 1 or 2 books from. So yeah, that's interesting. Then my average rating was 2.77, and this also sounds about right. I don't share my star ratings here because I don't think are helpful to other people, but they are helpful for me, so I do give stars. But my star rating works, I think, quite differently from other people's star ratings, so that's why I don't share it. I only give 5 stars to a book if it's something that really changed my mind, and if the moment I finish it I want to immediately open it again and reread it. And that doesn't happen very often. I don't think I have any 5-star reads this year. So that gives you an idea of how little 5 stars I give. Normally like 1 or 2 maximum a year. And my middle is 2.5 stars because that's 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. So 2.5 is something that I enjoyed, but it's not gonna stay with me. And lower than that means that there was something wrong with the book, and if it's like really offensive, I will give it 0 or 0.5 stars or something like that. And then if it's above average, I will give it 3 stars, and if it's like, let's say, one of my favorites of the year but nothing that it's my all-time favorite, and then it will get a 4 stars. So yeah, 2.77 sounds about right because it's around 2.5, and I would expect the books that I read to be around 2.5 stars. And yeah, the distribution here that you can see, most of the books I read are from between 1.75 and 3.25 stars. That's where most of my reading is, and that doesn't mean it's bad. It's just obviously not every book you read is going to have the same impact on you, and this is a way for me to see which books are my favorites, and when I do a list of recommendations or my favorites of the year and things like that, then I can just go to the books that have 4 stars or more, and even 3.75 and more, and that's where I get my recommendations from. And everything else is something that I read and I could have enjoyed, and there's nothing wrong with the book, but it's not my favorite, so it's in like 3-star or lower category. So yeah, that's how my star rating works, and that's why this distribution is like it is. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy the books I read, that just means that not every book is my favorite book ever. Then my highest average rating is February with 3.19. I don't know what happened there, but I'm happy that I had a good reading month. And the most pages that I read was in August. I read 6,662 pages, and I think that the booker has probably a lot of things to do with that. Then the book that I read that has the most ratings or the most shelved in Storygraph was Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. No surprise there. And the least shelved is South Strat by Dennis Enriquez, which I read for the Read Around the World project for I think it was San Martin. It was either San Martin or Aruba. It was one of the Dutch Caribbean islands. And it was fine. I'm not surprised that not a lot of people have read this book. I don't think it's a very popular book. I don't think it's translated, so it makes sense. Then the highest rated book that I have read was The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanonnet Joffers, which was also in my favorite books of the year. So I seem to agree with this, and this is also what I mean. Like, I gave it 3.75 stars and it's in my favorites, and most people gave it like 4.65 is the average, so clearly my ratings are a lot lower than most people, so that's, yeah, it works for me, but I don't think it gives the message that I'm trying to give, so that's why I don't share it normally. I explore works of 142 new authors, including Cecil Brown, Calvin, and Sastra Deo. That's also makes sense because I have been focusing a lot on my Read Around the World project, and that means a lot of countries I have not read from before, so also a lot of authors I have never read from before. Then 11 books that I read were part of a series. That's mainly the Harry Potter books and the John Fosse books. I don't normally read series. And yeah, I revisited a total of 7 books this year. Again, Harry Potter. I decided not to finish 5 of the books I picked up this year. And yeah, I don't DNF a lot, but the books are really not my taste, which sometimes happens, especially with prices and stuff, or also if I found it really offensive or really not correct. I remember I DNF The Story of More by Hope Jaren this year. I know that Hope Jaren is the favorite of a lot of people, but I have read Lab Girl from her and I really didn't like it. I think it is very toxic when it looks at academia, and how academia is portrayed in that book is very, very toxic, and I didn't like that. So when I picked up The Story of More, I was hoping it was not going to be like that, but then, I mean, I think it was like 3 pages in and she said something that was wrong, like something about cars and the US and stuff that was wrong, and I just didn't like the tone. I don't like the tone of her book, so that's one of the ones that I DNF, for example. I read 8 books from my own shelves this year. Yeah, I don't have... I marked as own in Storygraph the books that I physically own, not the ebooks or anything else. I read a lot of the ebooks I have, but those are not marked as own in the Storygraph. So I don't have that many books that I own. At the beginning of the year, I had 3 physical books that I had not read, and then I acquired some more throughout the year, and I read some of them. So that's where that 8 comes from. But I'm happy with that, and I successfully completed one reading challenge, which if I'm correct, it's the Orwell Prize for Fiction challenge. I didn't achieve a lot of the challenges I had. I had several challenges marked in Storygraph, but not to complete necessarily, just to have an idea of where I seated with certain book lists and stuff. For example, I joined the Booker Prize long list challenge because I wanted to know the books in the International Booker and the Booker quite fast. Also, I did make myself challenges for the 3 categories in the booktube prize, and I didn't complete any of them, but it was not my intention to complete those things. I just wanted to have an idea of what was in those lists and don't have to look back into the website every time and see which ones I had completed or not. So that was an easy way for me to do that. I also joined the Invisible Cities Challenge, even though I knew that I was not going to complete that, but it was again an easy way for me to know which countries were in the list, and I'm doing that this year as well. The one challenge I want to complete that I do have in Storygraph is the Read Around the World challenge, and I did make good progress on that this year. It's a big challenge because there is, I think, 198 countries in that. So obviously I didn't read 198 books. And then it says, compared to 2021, I didn't, I read the same amount of books, but the number of pages went down by 4%, which I'm okay with. I have read a lot in the last 2-3 years because pandemics and things like that, but I'm okay with reading less now. I think it's a good thing that if I read less, because that means that I'm focusing on other parts of my life that I kind of abandoned during the pandemic. I like to travel, I like to cook, I like to spend time with my family and my friends, and some of those things I didn't do much in the last 2-3 years, and so all that time that I had extra I put in reading because it was the easiest thing, but right now I'm regaining some of the hobbies that I had before, and also I've changed job to something much more exciting but also much more challenging, so that also takes time away from me from reading, and that's okay. I think there are certain times in our lives in which we sort of obsess over certain aspects of our lives, and then we grow out of that and we move to something else, and I think that's what I'm kind of in the process of doing. And I mean, it's not like I didn't read a lot. I still read a lot of books, but yeah, that's my thought. And I think that if I read less in 2023, I will also be happy with that, because as I said, there are other things in my life that I want to enjoy as well. The mood of the books that I read, and most of the books I read are emotional, dark, informative, challenging, and reflective. And that's not surprise. Again, as in the mood little curve thing, I like to read darker, more reflective, more dark books. I think that for me, reading is not something that I go for escapism and for pleasure necessarily. I do that with movies, for example, and series. I like fluffy, not very committed movies. But with books, because I am spending so much time with them, I want it to be something that makes me grow, and that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy the books I read. That just means that it's not just for the immediate pleasure. It's more of a longer term pleasure that I'm searching in books. Then in terms of pace, I read mostly medium pace books. I read a few of them that are fast paced, and a few of chunk that is slow paced, but most of it is medium paced, and I think that's also what I enjoy the most. I can appreciate a slow book, and I sometimes like a fast paced book if I'm feeling like it, but my core reading is medium paced books. I think it makes sense to me. In terms of page number, most of the books I read are less than 300 pages, which is a bit of a surprise maybe. I think when I think about my reading, I think that I read more between 300 and 400 pages, but apparently shorter books this year was a thing that I did. I also read a little bit of big books. I like an immersive book, but obviously if you read a 500-page book, you're gonna read less of them because they're just bigger. It will be interesting if they did like how many pages of the percentage of pages that you read that belong to a big book as opposed to the percentage of pages that you read that belong to a small book. If that makes sense, that makes sense, right? The split between nonfiction and fiction is exactly 25% to 75%, and that again doesn't surprise me. It has been there, around there, for several years now. Reads 25% nonfiction roughly, and that sits well with me as well, because I think nonfiction is important, but it also tends to be a little bit heavier and a little bit more time consuming and more energy consuming to read, so I don't read as much of it as fiction, but I do want it to be a considerable part of my reading still. And then in terms of format, I read 28% print, 60% digital, and 12% audio. And this is something that I do want to change next year. I do want to read more print books. I think that since the pandemic started, I have switched to digital a lot more because my library was closed for a while, and then it kind of became a habit. And then also, as I said, for middle of the night reading, digital is very useful. But I do enjoy the print more. So I think this is something I want to change, at least like half and half, or even a bit more print. We will see. Most of the books I have for the Read Around the World project are ebooks, just because they are easier to get. But any other book that I get, I think I'm going to try to do print, especially the older ones that you can buy secondhand. This is one of those that we will see how we go, because on one hand I do like print better, but on the other hand print is also more expensive, and if my library doesn't have it, it's sometimes very difficult to get. So we will see how the balance goes. And audio, I'm fine with audio. I don't... There are certain audiobooks that I enjoy, but I don't think that is something that I need to do all the time. So as I said, I do get scripts at random months throughout the year and listen to some books, and then I don't listen to anything for months and months, and that's fine with me. I don't think I want it to be a core part of my routine, but I also enjoy them every once in a while, and I think that some books do work better in audio. And also, my library doesn't really have audiobooks in English. I think all of the audiobooks that they have are in Dutch, and I just don't feel like listening to something in Dutch. So then the last statistic that we have is the languages that I read from, and no surprise here, 95.4% is English. So I mostly read books in English, but there was 2.6% in Spanish, 1.3% in French, and 0.7% in Dutch. Which again makes sense to me. Maybe I would like the Spanish to be a little bit higher, but at the same time it's very difficult for me to get Spanish books because I live in the Netherlands. My library has a few, but not many, and I don't visit that often, so 2.6% seems okay. And yeah, French and Dutch, I mean, I think that I speak better Dutch than I speak French now, because my French is very rusty. But when it comes to reading and understanding, I think I understand French a little bit better, just because it's closer to Spanish, and yeah, it's easier for me to read in French, because at one point in my life, I think I knew more French than the Dutch that I know now. So that's like passive memory works when I'm reading, but not when I'm talking. So anyway, that to say, this makes sense. I read most in English because that's the most available to me, and the one of the languages that I'm most comfortable with. Then Spanish because it's my mother tongue, and then French because I read better in French than in Dutch. So yeah, that sounds about right. I think that one side of me wants to read more in Dutch and in French to keep the languages going, but at the same time, I know that when I read books in French and Dutch, I do not enjoy them as much, and I sometimes just want to enjoy what I'm doing, and it doesn't all have to be for developing and for, I don't know, becoming smarter all the time. So I'm okay with reading a few of them a year and not having to make any challenge out of it or anything like that. So yeah, those were my stats for the year. Let me know what you think about that. If you found this interesting, what your stats were, how many books you read this year, how many pages you read this year, what was your favorite book of the year. And until next video, bye.